Here's the thing. They did wash their hands. This needs to be addressed immediately because the premise embedded in this video's title, while irresistible as a hook, contains an assumption that the historical record doesn't actually support. Ancient Romans washed their hands before meals as a matter of social convention, so established it was practically invisible, the way modern people buckle seatbelts. Ancient Egyptians washed regularly with a form of soap made from animal fat and plant ash. Islamic tradition codified ritual hand washing before prayer into religious law more than 1400 years ago, creating the most consistently practiced hand hygiene program in human history. Jewish law required ritual hand washing at multiple points in the day in ways so specific they had dedicated blessing formulas. So the more accurate and considerably more interesting question is, ancient humans washed their hands constantly for reasons that had nothing to do with germ prevention. And this created the fascinating situation where an enormous amount of genuine hygiene happened entirely by accident for the wrong reasons, while the actual biological mechanism that made it work remained completely invisible for most of human history. Let's start with what ancient people actually understood about why washing mattered, because this is where the real story lives. The concept of contamination, the idea that invisible particles from a sick person or a dirty surface could transfer to another person and make them sick, is not intuitive. It's actually a fairly counterintuitive idea, and when you stop to think about it, it's remarkable that anyone worked it out at all without the technology to directly observe microorganisms. Before germ theory was established in the second half of the 19th century, the dominant explanatory framework for infectious disease in most of the world was some version of miasma theory. The idea that bad air, specifically the foul-smelling emanations from rotting organic material, sick people, or polluted environments, caused disease. This theory was medically sophisticated enough to explain many observations correctly. Disease was more common near swamps, near sewage, in crowded, unsanitary environments, and less common in clean, well-ventilated spaces. It explained the pattern of disease even though it got the mechanism completely wrong, which is a genuinely important point about how scientific theories can be predictively useful while being fundamentally mistaken about causes. The miasma framework meant that washing had a logic, bad smells were associated with bad air, which was associated with disease, and washing removed bad smells, so washing was connected to health. But the connection was atmospheric rather than direct contact. And this meant that hand washing specifically, as opposed to bathing generally or keeping environments clean, didn't occupy the privileged position in ancient hygiene thinking that it has in modern public health. You washed because you smelled bad, because it was socially expected, because religious law required it, or because it made you feel comfortable. That it was also interrupting the fecal-oral transmission route of multiple major pathogens was, from the ancient perspective, incidental. Let's bring up the ritual purity dimension specifically, because this is one of the most important and underappreciated drivers of hand-washing behavior across human history. Ritual purity systems, which appear in some form in virtually every major religious tradition, created extensive behavior patterns around washing that were justified in spiritual rather than hygienic terms. The Jewish concept of ritual impurity, tumah, required washing in specific circumstances, including after contact with certain categories of things, before eating, after toilet use, and after handling a corpse. The Islamic concept of tahara required wudu, ritual ablution, including washing hands, face, and feet before prayer. Hindu ritual bathing requirements, particularly before religious observance, created consistent hygiene practices. Buddhist monastery hygiene codes were sufficiently explicit about hand-washing practices that they've been cited by historians of hygiene as contributing to lower disease transmission in monastic communities. None of these ritual washing requirements were understood by their practitioners as germ prevention. They were understood as spiritual practices, maintaining a state of ritual readiness for religious observance, or removing a spiritually significant state of contamination. But the behavioral result, regular washing that happened to remove pathogens, was the same regardless of the framework that motivated it. This is one of the more interesting cases in the history of medicine where a practice that worked preceded the understanding of why it worked by thousands of years. And the understanding didn't actually add to the effectiveness of the practice, it just changed the justification. Let's bring up ancient soap specifically, because soap's history is both older and more complicated than most people assume. The oldest known soap recipe, found on a Babylonian clay tablet dating to around 2800 BCE, describes a mixture of water, alkali, and cassia oil, which is functionally soap, used for washing wool in textile production rather than specifically for human hygiene. Egyptian papyri from around 1550 BCE describe similar fat and ash preparations used for washing. The Romans developed sophisticated soap making and used soap extensively, though interestingly, Roman bathing culture initially emphasized mechanical cleaning with strigils, scrapers used to remove oil and dirt, over soap application. By the medieval period, soap manufacturing had become an established industry in various European cities, with Castile soap from Spain and Aleppo soap from Syria representing early commercial soap products traded across regions. The chemistry of soap, which makes it effective against pathogens, is elegant. Soap molecules have a water-attracting head and a fat-attracting tail. When you wash with soap, the fat-attracting tails of soap molecules surround and attach to the lipid envelope of pathogens, including most viruses and many bacteria, while the water-attracting heads allow the whole complex to be rinsed away with water. This mechanism was completely unknown to anyone making or using soap until the 20th century, but it meant that soap use was genuinely reducing pathogen transmission even when no one understood why soap worked any better than plain water, which it significantly does. Let's bring up the single most consequential moment in the history of hand washing as a medical intervention, because this story is both genuinely remarkable and a useful illustration of how slowly understanding can change even when evidence is strong. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working in the Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, where he noticed something that seemed inexplicable given the medical knowledge of the time. The hospital had 2 maternity wards with dramatically different rates of childbed fever, the postpartum infection that killed a terrifying proportion of women who gave birth in hospital settings at the time. The first ward, staffed by medical students and doctors who came directly from performing autopsies, had mortality rates around 10 to 15%. The second ward, staffed by midwives, had mortality rates around 2%. The difference was stark enough that women who were forced to give birth in the first ward were so frightened of it that some chose to give birth in the street rather than be admitted there. Semmelweis connected the mortality difference to the cadaverous particles that doctors and students were carrying from the autopsy room to the maternity ward on their unwashed hands. He implemented a hand-washing protocol using chlorinated lime solution, not soap, and mortality in the first ward dropped to roughly 2%, matching the second ward. He had essentially discovered that hand-washing could prevent transmission of infectious material that killed patients, without knowing what the particles were or how they caused infection. The response from the medical establishment was largely hostile. His evidence was dismissed, his theory was considered implausible, and he was eventually committed to a mental institution where he died of the same kind of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. His hand-washing protocol was abandoned after his departure. Germ theory, developed in the following decades by Pasteur and Koch, eventually provided the mechanistic understanding that made Semmelweis's findings comprehensible in retrospect. And modern medicine finally rehabilitated him as a pioneer, roughly 30 years after he died largely unrecognized. The Semmelweis story is worth dwelling on because it illustrates something genuinely important about how hygiene behavior changes. The evidence that hand-washing worked was clear. The mortality statistics were unambiguous. But in the absence of a mechanistic theory that explained why hand-washing worked, the evidence was insufficient to change established practice. Partly because accepting it would have required physicians to accept that they were killing their patients by failing to wash their hands, which was psychologically and professionally uncomfortable in ways that motivated finding reasons to reject the evidence rather than accept it. The history of hand-washing as a medical intervention is not simply a story of ignorance being replaced by knowledge. It's a story about the social and psychological dynamics of how medical evidence is accepted or rejected. Let's bring up germ theory itself and its consequences for hand-washing, because the establishment of germ theory in the 1860s and 1870s changed everything in principle, while the behavioral change at the population level took considerably longer. Louis Pasteur's microbiology and Joseph Lister's application of antiseptic principles in surgery, inspired by Pasteur's work, established that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases and that they could be killed with appropriate chemical agents. This created a mechanistic justification for hand washing that Semmelweis's evidence alone had failed to provide, and it catalyzed a revolution in hospital hygiene that dramatically reduced surgical mortality. The transition from hospital-based hygiene reform to population-level hand-washing education was slower and required sustained public health campaigning through the late 19th and 20th centuries. The germ theory revolution occurred in an era when bacteria were the primary focus, and the role of hand-washing in preventing the fecal-oral transmission of diseases like cholera and typhoid was a central concern of the early public health movement. But translating scientific understanding of microbial transmission into behavioral change at the population level required not just education, but the development of the infrastructure that makes regular hand-washing practical. Running water, soap, clean towels, all of which were not universally available in most of the world until relatively recently. Let's bring up something genuinely important about what ancient hygiene practices did work, setting aside the hand-washing framework because ancient humans weren't simply helpless in the face of pathogen transmission. Many traditional food practices that we now understand in microbiological terms, cooking meat thoroughly, preserving food through fermentation or salt or drying, avoiding specific categories of food in specific conditions, had genuine pathogen reduction effects, even though they were justified in terms of taste, tradition, or in some cases religious law. Fermentation specifically produces an acidic environment that inhibits the growth of most pathogens, which is why fermented foods are often safer than raw, fresh foods with similar contamination risks. The development of fermentation as a food preservation technology across virtually every human culture was driven by practical necessity rather than microbial understanding. But the microbial effect was real. Traditional quarantine practices represent another case of effective pathogen control without germ theory. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantino, referring to the 40-day isolation period that Venice imposed on arriving ships during the Black Death. This practice worked at reducing transmission without any understanding of how plague spread, because the behavioral intervention of isolating potentially infected individuals from the general population reduces transmission regardless of whether you understand the mechanism or call the causative agent Yersinia pestis or bad air from the east. The long history of isolating sick people, documented across multiple cultures in various forms, represents a convergent behavioral discovery of a genuinely effective disease control measure arrived at entirely without the theoretical framework that would explain it. Let's bring up something genuinely interesting about the hand-washing behavior we do know ancient people practiced and what it was specifically preventing, because the epidemiological effectiveness of ancient hygiene practices was uneven in ways that track exactly with what germ theory would predict, but that ancient practitioners couldn't have anticipated. Washing hands before eating, which was widely practiced across cultures for reasons of social decorum and ritual purity, interrupts the fecal-oral transmission route that spreads gastrointestinal pathogens including cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and many other major killers. The cultures with the most consistent ritual hand-washing before meals would have had, all else equal, lower rates of these specific diseases compared to cultures without this practice, through a mechanism no one involved understood. The epidemiological signature of ritual hygiene practices as disease prevention is genuinely visible in historical disease patterns once you know what to look for. Let's bring up the modern hand-washing moment specifically, because the evidence for hand-washing effectiveness has never been stronger, and the infrastructure for hand-washing has never been more broadly available. Yet, hand hygiene compliance remains a genuine public health challenge, even in settings where people know exactly why it matters. Healthcare worker hand hygiene compliance in hospitals, studied extensively because it's directly measurable and consequential, is often below 60%. Even in facilities where hand-washing protocols are explicit, signage is everywhere, and personnel are educated about both the science and the mortality stakes. This persistent non-compliance in a setting where the rationale is completely understood suggests that knowledge alone is insufficient to drive behavior change, and that the behavioral barriers to consistent hand hygiene are not primarily about understanding why it matters. Let's bring up something genuinely fascinating about the Roman bath culture specifically, because this represents one of the most elaborate hygiene systems in the ancient world, one that actually gets a somewhat unfair historical reputation. The popular image of Roman baths as communal pools of progressively dirtier water shared by hundreds of people is not entirely wrong, but misses the considerable sophistication of the Roman bathing system. Major Roman bath complexes, the thermae, moved water through a sequence of increasingly hot rooms, with the frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium representing a progression of temperature zones that served both social and cleaning functions. The hypocaust underfloor heating system that maintained these temperatures was genuine engineering, and the Roman investment in aqueduct infrastructure to supply fresh water to bath complexes was substantial. The baths weren't simply dirty pools, but systems with incoming fresh water and drainage that, by the standards of available technology, were reasonably sophisticated. What the Roman baths did not do was prevent the transmission of waterborne and contact-transmitted pathogens in the way a modern understanding of pathogen transmission would require. Warm communal water with multiple bathers is an ideal environment for certain skin conditions, fungal infections, and pathogens transmitted through contaminated water. Romans suffered from these conditions, and the baths were part of the reason, but this was entirely invisible to them because the causal chain from shared bathwater to fungal skin infection wasn't understood. The baths were simultaneously a genuine public health asset through the mechanical removal of skin contamination and a pathogen transmission venue through the warm communal water environment in ways that ancient practitioners couldn't disentangle. Let's bring up something worth noting about the development of clean water infrastructure and its relationship to hygiene behavior, because the availability of water has shaped hand-washing behavior in ways that are sometimes underappreciated. The Roman investment in aqueducts, which brought fresh water into urban centers at a scale unmatched in the Western world until the 19th century, made frequent washing practically feasible in a way that it wasn't in most ancient cities. Roman urban populations had access to running water at public fountains and bath complexes that their counterparts in most medieval European cities would not have after the aqueduct infrastructure collapsed. The medieval decline in hand-washing behavior in Europe is partly a story about the collapse of water infrastructure that made washing convenient, not purely about a decline in hygiene knowledge or motivation. The relationship between water access and hand hygiene remains directly relevant globally. Current estimates suggest that over 2 billion people worldwide lack access to a basic hand-washing facility with soap and water, meaning the barrier to hand-washing compliance for these populations is not knowledge or motivation, but physical access to the necessary resources. The public health campaigns that focus on hand-washing education in low-resource settings have faced the challenge that educational interventions alone can't increase hand-washing where the infrastructure to support it doesn't exist, which has pushed global health organizations toward infrastructure investment as a complement to behavioral education. Let's also bring up something genuinely interesting about the specific bacteria that hand-washing is most important for preventing, because the fecal-oral transmission route that hand-washing most directly interrupts is responsible for a range of diseases that have been major historical killers. Cholera, caused by Vibrio. Cholerae transmitted through fecally contaminated water and food killed millions in the 19th century pandemic waves that swept across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi with a similar transmission route, was a major urban killer before modern water treatment. Hepatitis A, norovirus, rotavirus, and numerous other enteric pathogens share transmission routes that are interrupted by washing hands after toilet use and before food preparation or eating. The burden of diarrheal disease globally, which remains a leading cause of child mortality in low-income countries despite being almost entirely preventable, is directly connected to hand hygiene and water sanitation. Understanding which pathogens are most responsive to hand hygiene also helps explain a historical puzzle. Why did cultures with high ritual hygiene standards not necessarily have dramatically lower mortality from infectious disease overall? The answer is that many of the major historical killers, plague, smallpox, influenza, malaria, typhus, were primarily transmitted through routes other than the fecal-oral route that hand washing most effectively interrupts.